Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with creativity and storytelling. And my goal, as always, is to try to find interesting people to talk to and find out what makes them tick. I'm Sean Murphy, your host. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University. I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. I'm also a writer. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. But the focus of this podcast series is, again, to be in conversation with extraordinary people. Today, what can I say? I was saying right before we came on air, never meet your heroes, they say. That's nonsense, especially when you're in the artistic community, because it's just such a rare and wonderful experience. I am joined today by poet and American hero, Richard Blanco. Let me introduce him properly and then we'll jump in. And you can probably sense my giddiness, which I'm not even going to try to subdue. Selected by President Obama as the fifth presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history, Richard Blanco was the youngest, the first Latinx, immigrant, and gay person to serve in that role. In 2023, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Biden. He was born in Madrid to Cuban exile parents and raised in Miami in a working class family. His personal negotiation of cultural identity and the universal themes of place and belonging characterize his many collections of poetry, including his most recent Homeland of My Body. Richard's won numerous awards, has been aptly described as this century's Walt Whitman, and was appointed in 2022 as the first ever poet laureate of Miami-Dade County. Richard, it's an extraordinary honor to have you here. As a poet, of course, I'm humbled to be in esteemed company. As an arts advocate, I'm honored to be in conversation, but just as a human being, I'm super inspired to feel the solidarity and share some time with you. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. You're absolutely right. Solidarity is the word. We're all in this together.
Yeah, well, I mean, and what better place to start? Because I think, there's so much that your work does, but the notion of solidarity, the notion that we all come from one and must be united. I'd love to peel that back a little bit, especially you know, when I was putting some notes together, even though it's borderline cliche, I don't know if poets have the opportunity to invoke Percy Bysshe Shelley's immortal quote that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Um, we love that quote for all the obvious reasons. But I really do feel, cliche be damned, it's never been more appropriate than it is in 2025. When our elected officials let us down, we always have the artists. Um, how correct is that assessment, especially thinking about poetry and your place as a poet and advocate?
Yeah, thanks. That is one of my favorite quotes as well. That I keep on coming back to remind myself. A couple of things about that. I got to say it's been a journey. Of course, like my first book and second book, maybe even the third book, always focused more on the sort of autobiographical sphere, which was still in some ways political, right? Being an immigrant, being a Cuban, working class, and gay. So the mere act of being a writer was already somewhat social political in the context of my own background, but it was really serving as presidential inaugural poet where I started to really dig deeper into thinking, well, what happened was I realized I'm not the only one with this question of, what is home? Where do I belong? Am I part of the American narrative? In fact, that was one of the hardest things about writing the inaugural poem was to get a better sense of do I love this country? Does this country love me back? What's actually the more important question.
Right.
And the inaugural poem, in a way, is a response to that question in the affirmative, not just for myself, but for all of us. And so the book and the writing has changed. So it changed my life in many ways, right? I mean, I got to meet Beyonce for Christ's sake.
Right.
Talk about meeting your heroes.
Yeah.
But then it also obviously changed what I thought a poem was, or what I thought a poem could do in the world. And so I sort of got out of my comfort zone and started thinking, well, that book, the title is How to Love a Country, which is really actually a question mark as well. What is a country? How do we love it? What does that mean? And so I started writing more more in terms of, I guess, again with that same question in mind, but not no longer the poetry of just me, but the poetry of we, right? And it was scary because there's experiences that I don't have firsthand experiences that I have to be very careful how I speak about it or through it or whatever or for it, or however that means, including racism, which I'm not, I'm a white person of color, right? So you have to think about all those things. But really, the inauguration and that whole moment also made me think of how what does poetry do in the world? What can it do in the world, right? Um, I'm not naive in the sense of, oh, well, or I always like to say, I don't think a poem can change the world, right? But I think a poem can change a person and that person does the work. And I think that's what the quote, unacknowledged legislators of the world, that we don't always see the ripple effects of where how our art affects people and how that really has, incredible. I mean, I can imagine maybe even Obama himself being like moved by a poem, right? That sort of
Right.
shifts the direction in their lives. So we rarely get to see that. I've got to see it a little bit more because of such a public platform that I have now.
Sure.
But I think that's part of how, and I would say it's not just poetry. I think arts in general, the humanities in general, are doing this work all the time and always questioning. I always like to say when things are going well, poets are always like, what the hell is going wrong? And when things are going wrong, we're like, well, let's be hopeful and let's look at the beautiful flower. I mean, we serve different purposes as times change. And right now, I'm still in a holding pattern. I'm not sure what my next work looks like, but
Yeah.
I've been talking to a lot of poetry community, and part of what we're feeling is also that beauty and joy are also radical right now, right? That sometimes we're always on this, mega, 3,000 megawatt, in our heads, right? And that maybe we need to also take a pause and just breathe, right? To do the work that we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying just makes me think again, like the notion that the personal is the political. Well, people can get behind that, and I think understand what that means. But when it comes to art and what art does, one of the reasons I'm maintaining a kind of a recalcitrant hope right now, and maybe a stubborn sense of purpose, is it is at times when art is threatened that we're reminded why it's powerful. If it wasn't powerful, nobody would care about it. And when times are difficult and we look at elected officials or leaders in the community that aren't doing what they said they were going to do, it's what art provides that we find lacking. So in a weird kind of ironic way, art is most important when people finally wake up and remember, oh, this is why art is important. It's what makes life worthwhile to be able to communicate, to be able to understand outside perspectives, and to have it brought home in ways that op-eds and political screeds can't do. Um,
Exactly.
and you quote the great James Baldwin at the beginning of, and I'll just hold it up, How to Love a Country. It's such a wonderful articulation. Baldwin writes, and you quote, "The role of the artist is exactly the same as the role of the lover. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." I think that just contains multitudes, but it gets at it's an act of love, it's an act of passion, but there's a desire to connect. And I think for people that don't understand art or want to understand it better, that's the impulse, right? To create community with a small c or a big C, but this notion of using words, using our creative capacity to unite, as opposed to, which maybe is a very blunt way of separating what politics does, right? The art of dividing and separating. Art at its base is always trying to extend a conversation and open a dialogue.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. In so many ways. A couple of things. I think we've also noticed, right? I wouldn't say it's a renaissance, but we've also seen over the past 2 decades, right? Going back a bit, how poetry has had more and more of a place in our society. I see it in my at the university where I teach. It naturally starts filling in that need, right? Because exactly like you said, the 24-hour news reels, they abstract all these issues. They don't really inform, right? So what does an artist do? She or they put a real name, a real face, real tears, real laughter, to these abstract issues. And then suddenly that becomes a lot harder to deny, or at least it also opens up another kind of dialogue or another kind of experience. And That's what I try to do in my work. Every poet is a little bit different in how they negotiate the poetics of protest versus the poetics of unity, right? So I always, in my book, I always try to think, that a poem should more unite than divide, or it should open up another door. I mean, sometimes we have to state the problem, right? But I don't like the poem to just stay in the problem, right? That it has to sort of, that's what artists do. They offer perhaps a little bit of light at the end of tunnel. And even if that's just here, hey, have you ever thought about it this way? I'll give you a concrete example, which is a poem in How to Love a Country, which is based on a photograph actually, but it's Complaint of El Rio Grande, right? And I thought, how am I going to speak to this issue that's so overspoken about, right? Like, I've
Right.
been hearing about the border issue since I was a kid. And
Sure.
so I just wrote the poem in the voice as a persona poem in the voice of a river and really started thinking even larger about what are borders and why, they're artificial. They're kind of a construct for power and wealth, have always been throughout history. So that's the way an artist can solve something, and people listen to that poem, and sure, it's referencing border issues in some ways, but it's also wrestling with a larger issue of how we are always dividing ourselves in one way or another, and the river's kind of giving all of humanity a what for. So I myself learn because I think the practice of art makes you also, it challenges you to question your assumptions about even what you feel about something or what you know about an issue. And maybe you don't know everything yet. So, for all those reasons, I think it's part of why I do what we do, what I do, and why we do what we do. And again, it's sometimes even just showing up personally and autobiographically is also a powerful way of bearing witness, right?
Yes, and bearing witness. I think one of the many reasons that your work resonates so powerfully with me. Uh, I'm the ideal reader in the sense that I'm that guy. English major, poet, writer and reader. But what people when we talk about craft is it's easy or it's easier to write a screed or to identify the problem and rail against it, to feel self-righteous, but to be able to identify an issue, to describe it in a new way, but also either implicitly or explicitly have this warm, like this invitation to engage is of course much more difficult than it might appear. But your poetry is consistently, especially your more recent work, right, which is more politically engaged, only in the sense, because certainly that can be used by the wrong people as a pejorative, but it's more politically engaged in the sense that it's reacting to the times that we're in. It's somebody bearing witness to injustice, confusion, and in a way, by not identifying a simple cause or a simple solution, it's necessarily complicating the issue, which I think is ultimately what art does. And when you read a poem like Rio Grande, and I have written down Staring at Aspens, which I'd love to talk about a little bit. Once somebody sees that and gets the history, the personal narrative, and this bizarre both connection and distance from the events or people described, you can never unsee it. And I
Right.
think that also gets at why art is powerful and why, as whenever in human history there's authoritarian leanings, eventually they come after art because they recognize that they can't do art and they can't do what art does, which is unite rather than divide.
Yeah, you make think just real quickly. You're making me think about how authoritarian, how little or no art authoritarian regimes have created. And I remember somehow fall just uh, I don't know, just coincidentally, this is years ago, like about Nazi architecture, and it was just horrible. Like it's not informed by anything but just that ideology. But a couple of things you said, you know. I also stray away from the word social political for these same reasons we're talking about it. I like to think about it as art of social conscience, right? That we're just bringing up the consciousness of what we're looking at in our times and historically, and and how that has sort of again made me question my own what information am I getting, right? But the Aspen poem is also that was also based on a photograph. 12 of the poems in there are based on a collaborative project with the photographer Jacob Hessler, which dealt on the issue of boundaries, all kinds of boundaries, not just geographical. Um, but I think also, again, the work that when you were saying the history, I mean, this is the first time that was starting to write poems that sometimes it was hours and hours and hours of research to educate myself
Yeah.
to then be able to have an emotional response to something. But, and then also realizing, oh my God, like I've been just as ignorant as other people that right, that all this stuff has happened, and why did I not know about this? So part of part of what this is what my mentor taught me, or maybe he coined the phrase in some ways, is that poets and artists are emotional historians, right? That we record what it felt like to live at a certain time, all the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, right? And that in that way, again, the bearing witness, and it becomes much more powerful when when we think about when we study a civilization in the past, right? What's the first things we turn to are the arts, right? Because it tells the real story in terms of what was it like, right? And we don't, things like we're saying that a newspaper article or even an op-ed won't, or even a history book won't cover it because, of course, it depends who's writing the history,
That's
right?
right.
So that's another. I put that up there with the and acknowledged legislators of the world that poets are also in some of these emotional historians. Seamus Heaney, I think, I hope this is not a misquote, um, or something I've just made up, but said something to the degree that poets are the keepers of the unseen. And that's
Mm,
another way of thinking about it, right? That here's what
sure.
you're not seeing. Kind of like just the Baldwin quote, right? I have to tell you what you don't see, right?
Right.
What's wrong, right? So,
Yeah. And I think, and I really appreciate that you brought up the research component because again, I mean, I'm always happy. I don't need an invitation to talk craft, but without getting heavily into craft, it underscores the responsibility of an honest artist trying to write authentic work. I mean, obviously there needs to be a feeling and an emotional connection, and that's both the magic and I think the expertise coming into play. But the responsibility of the poet is like a tour guide to have it right, and to go deeper. And it's, I think, this notion of being curious, like insatiably curious about one's own history, one's own background, then the history of the country, and all these connecting themes. But the work that goes into something that can end up being one page or much shorter, there often is. I think the poems that last are telling some kind of truth, maybe with a capital T. I mean, all poetry, right, is a person's truth and how they're feeling. But when we're talking about really trying to push oneself to write enduring work, I think there's this responsibility to the humans that didn't have voices, that to bear witness for the voices that haven't been heard historically, systemically. Again, in my not so humble opinion, this is the through line of your work. It's giving voice to things we need to hear, but then the deeper you go, it should be things we want to hear and then discuss and explore, and we come out the other end different.
yeah, it's not just about the other things that I like to say often is good poetry answers questions. Great poetry keeps on asking them, right? So the poem in the end is not a resolution, but rather a door, right, to opening up just another different kind of conversation. that I hopefully will lead to will lead to other conclusions or other possibilities. And it's very tricky as an artist, right? And again, particularly for this book, I should say why I gave myself permission to sort of break my own autobiographical boundary was because I felt that many of these stories were in some ways autobiographical
Sure.
because they had the same questions that is the at this that is the core question of this country, right?
Yeah.
Out of the many one, yeah, how do we do that? How are we ever going to do that, right? Have we ever even moved? Have we done some of that work? How much work is, but it's the same question at the heart of my personal work, which is home, place, belonging. I just realized that question got a lot bigger, that it wasn't just my cultural identity, or Cuba versus being Cuban versus American, but rather, it's really a universal question that everybody has on their mind. And in particular, when when that question needs to be examined most, right? Yeah, and how to honor, how to speak with, for, how do you work with that history? But when I was doing that research, it's really some of it is just getting just familiarizing yourself with your history, with the history that you're working with, right, trying to write around or through.
Right.
But what I'm also looking is for, as a poet, right, is I'm looking for that one thing that will open up my heart and my soul to understanding this in a way that an artist can and not a historian. Um, and sometimes, uh, for example, the poem about Angel Island, I can't tell you how many dozens of interviews I read, video interviews that I saw of the older generations that had been detained at Angel Island, speaking to their children, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, and to hear the stories from their own mouth was like, what? And then finally, I felt that connection. Okay, I can write about this now because there's an emotional, as they say in poetry, right? It's about emotional honesty. You can't just write about something just because, oh, it's bad, right? You have to connect with it personally as an artist to be able to get to that space where others will feel that also, that you're not appropriating, you're just really bearing witness in a way that's really heartfelt. So yeah, that was every poem in that book had some interesting like genesis that I had never written poetry that way because for the most part you don't research your own auto. Well, though you do a bit, right? Your
Sure.
family history and whatnot, but not in the same way.
Yeah, and getting back to craft, that is, I think, both the appeal for readers, but for those of us that do this kind of addictive quality of the curiosity goes deeper and realizing that the act of discovery can surprise, perhaps often surprises the writer more than the reader. And I think again, it's the deeper you go, the more universal, the more connection can occur, and it's this fascinating kind of enigma, but it's at once very simple, but when you look into it, of course, like any human life, it's very profound.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. That's why I'm addicted to poetry because, in some ways, every time I finish a poem, I learn something new about myself, about someone in my life, about an issue, about gosh, a memory, because as Anais like famously said, writers taste life twice, and we take the time to go back over this
Right.
to see not only how we feel about it, but what can we offer the world in terms of what we've learned. A poem to me, I say, is always also, as we like to say, also, right. Once we finish a poem, it's no longer ours, but
Right.
the idea is really that it's a gift, a very humble gift. It's not. But here it is. I went through all this work and now here it is on the page, and hopefully that'll stir in the reader or the listener also that or replicate that same experience that one had in that discovery and that aha and that oh those moments. Yeah.
Yeah, and listen, to tie a few threads together, like we've talked about the research, we've talked about the emotional honesty, we've talked about bearing witness, all of which poetry does, but I think your poetry does in particular. The one word I don't think either of us have mentioned yet, because it's a given, but I would say what poetry does that we find lacking in historical research or reporting or so many other forms of both art and nonfiction is this notion of empathy. And I
Mm.
think that's ultimately right what ties together the hard-hitting truths or the research and the facts or the showing, right, of I want you to see this because it needs to be seen, but done with empathy. That's where the again implicit or explicit invitation to share that moment as humans, which only human beings can do in the way we do it by the way we communicate. But this empathy that runs through, I think, does separate and elevate poetry as an art form because that to me is how it can do the things it does that we can't quite explain, but how does it do it so forcefully? And it's the combination of everything we've talked about laced through with empathy.
Yeah, that's I wish there were a better word than empathy in our English language because it's at least it's got so many different connotations. It's so close to sympathy, right? But
Right.
I've thought about that a lot, and I think not just poetry but the humanities. If they teach us anything, it's one thing is first also have empathy with ourselves, right? But also empathy in the sense of the ability to think to place yourself in someone's shoes, right? The ability to say, and that lesson is applicable. One of the things they didn't, the White House didn't highlight in the press release that I'm also the first engineer to serve as a inaugural poet. But right, even in my engineering job, you would see that people lack the ability to put themselves in someone else's shoes, or in this case, in the shoes of the user, right? If you're going to drive down a road, well, think about actually driving down the road, right? You just the radius on that curve is a little too tight, right? If the speed limit is 50 miles an hour. Or
Yeah.
even, and you could see it all the time. There's like, this, I'm doing this in the abstract. I'm not really putting myself in the design. And so I think the humanities project, I always tell all my students, regardless of your major or where you're going on to do, always keep arts in your life in some ways because it might not be your lead horse, but it's going to help you take that lead horse, whatever you're doing, to the next level. Because it's just the idea of being able to turn things around and have another perspective. And that kind of skill, even, is again applicable to almost any human endeavor. And this is, of course, when we talked about, taking away art and authoritarian regimes, this is why they're doing away with humanities. And they don't want people to think in that way. They just want people to be a robot and forget about feeling empathy or even thinking about a problem or a new dimension to something. They just want you to, just a robot. So, but empathy, I'll say also that empathy for me also comes, and this is where it's also very personal, autobiographical.
Yeah.
you know, as I like to say, my mother is more of an American than I could ever be. Right? And she leaves Cuba 7 months pregnant with me, leaves her entire family behind, her 8 brothers and sisters, etc. And I think her story in particular, but just my family, my community, my Cuban exile community, although now, we're not all like what you see on the news either, right?
Sure.
My mom, happy to vote, has been converting. She voted. She voted, and for a woman of her age, of that generation, she voted for. She voted not only for. Uh, she voted not only Democrat, but for a woman. She voted for Hillary Clinton back in the day. So anyway, I think they've instilled in me incredible optimism and real patriotic sense of this country that we often take for granted. Those of us that just grew up here or were born here. And I'm constantly reminded of that. And that gives me also in some ways, um, how do I say, motivation or inspiration to continue to explore these questions, but also with that kind of, uh, I can't describe the word. It's like, well, yeah, like the real patriotism, where like they
Right.
really just are so grateful for this country and what it all stood for. And by contrast, I can see where it's going and thinking, what they went through leaving an authoritarian regime. And I'm thinking, is this going to happen in my lifetime? So it's also very scary. But
Yeah.
I think that optimism, empathy is all rolled into there.
Yeah.
that that we try to understand things in a different way because something has to make sense somehow.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, but to, you know, put a bow on that, I think it's simply suffice to say that an empathetic society is incapable of fascism because of all the things we've mentioned. Hence the systemic attack on humanities, wanting to eliminate curiosity, eliminate empathy in any way possible. But it also, what you just beautifully articulated brings me back to something that I'm fond of repeating, which is, it's ultimately everything is narrative, especially in America and storytelling. And it's like, how in 2025 do we combat, you know, genuine fake news, bad information, bad storytelling? And my answer, is tell better stories. And it's like, well, then how do you do that? And telling better stories involves having empathy, even for the people that might not be hearing what you're trying to say, and opening up a dialogue. And I think one of the mistakes, those of us that want progressive solutions that are very achievable, maybe fall short of is the invitation to dialogue. How to tell a better story that becomes irresistible. How to make people understand that maybe they're voting against their own interests. Maybe their fears and are being exploited. How to do that without antagonizing, how to do that without sounding superior. I do think, again, that's something that art does, that we as artists have to make more relatable and accessible and celebrate that. Um, it ties together how people can understand how storytelling works.
Yeah. Um, yeah, there's and it's true. And again, we always see the gray, right? Which is another way of thinking about empathy. And I love what you said about maybe even if they're not listening, but someone's listening, that someone may have another dialogue with someone who's not listening to you, and maybe they're able to continue or create a conversation. But it is the dark side of the progressive of being progressive, where I'm going to put myself in there, can be very blindsided to things. And very ignorant of things at the same time. And there's a lot of, and we sometimes feel that, oh, we don't have to do the work. We know all the answers, right? And how is that different than the other side, so to speak, right? But I think we have an extra duty because if we're thinking of ourselves as the thinkers, then we need to also, again, empathy, all these kinds of things we're thinking about. I'll give you a really concrete example. Um, and this is like sort of living room, parlor talk, right? Where everybody's like, "How could the Latinos vote for like?"
Yep.
Have
Yeah.
you even met someone of this? Do you not
Right.
understand human nature, that it's fear? Do you understand that if you come to this country, I'm not saying it's right, but you need to understand it, right? You
Yeah.
come to this country with nothing, you make it big, you have a natural fear that you're going to be that poor person again, and they're not even aware of it, right? But it's this, you have a repulsion against, you don't want to associate yourself with that contingency anymore because it reminds you that where you came from, and it reminds you that maybe, or it's probably, an irrational fear that you could land back in that space, right? So, it's the idea, I got mine, you get yours. The other thing, I'll be even more concrete about, some of my own Cuban contingency in Miami, that my mom is still like, how they don't see this as a dictatorship, and they don't. Um,
Right.
and part of it is, if you really think in terms of empathy, they've never known a democracy. So
Right.
like
Right.
the only thing, it's like it's just like presses that button and they feel that's right, right? Like for better or for worse, or at least I'll speak in terms of human history, it's always been colonialism and then another dictator, then US intervention and then Castro and then it's always, and so that's what how could you expect them perhaps not to react to it that way? Um, and so how can we have that conversation, right? Like one of the poems in the book, How to Love Mother Country, talks about that in some ways. Uh, uh, and it was like, well, how can place yourself in an immigrant's shoes, which is what I wanted that poem to do, and think about think about what's at stake in terms of my mother, comparing an that sort of an analogy to my mother having to leave. everything she knew behind because of
Yeah,
political babble, right? And think about for both of us, right? For both wherever we are on the spectrum, right? Think about what's really at stake. The other side, are we really analyzing the problem? Are we looking at the problem the right way? And then just questioning again our assumptions about what's right or wrong. You know, I gotta tell you, even my party, they're still in shock about, again, how Latinos are losing the Latino vote. Well, you're not looking at several things, right? And the black vote, right? We're not all in, I think sometimes they think we're all just picking lettuce in the fields.
sure.
There are Mexicans have been part of this country for several generations, right? Or in fact, most of this country was Mexico, right?
That's right.
And they're not thinking that there's actually CEOs of companies that are, and they're not thinking about those people as immigrants, right? They're not thinking about those people having an immigrant heritage and how they think about the world differently than someone who is in the fields, who is an agricultural worker. And so you're only sort of your messaging is only going to this part, right? And then I'll go on too, like which is something that's happening when you bring into play machismo, right? Which is elevated in Latino cultures. We all have it, every single culture, but dialing into that, that's partly why there's the losing that vote too.
Right.
Is it raw? Is it right? Probably not. I would say no, but is it the reality? It is. Once you understand the reality, then maybe there's something else that can be done.
For sure. I mean, in fact, you just hit on, one of my obsessions. I had a collection of fiction come out entitled This Kind of Man, but what I've been spending a lot of time since 2016, initially unwillingly, but wanting to see or try to grapple with this problem, as a straight white male, not necessarily taking accountability, but exactly what you just described, looking at my people, for lack of a better, stereotype, but where is this anger coming from? Where is this disconnect? How are people actively, in many instances, voting against their own interests? And for me, it was actually taking a step back and realizing, getting back to narrative, it's late stage capitalism, machismo, and toxicity. These are the results of a system that's designed to separate people, to make people not have a fair share, and of course, pitting people against each other. It's a false narrative that the macho guy believes. Like, you don't show feelings, you don't show emotional, vulnerability, you don't empathize because that's weakness, and you don't win. When we start deconstructing, what does win mean? How is not communicating vulnerability a sign of strength? That's the stuff as a culture we need to unpack. And then it becomes much less easy to say, well, yeah, if the white dudes weren't in power, everything would be okay. It's like, for sure. But it's got to go a lot deeper than that. How did the white men get angry? Why do certain types of white men want to keep the status quo that doesn't help them in their own lives? It's not that complicated. What's complicated is how to talk about it honestly and compellingly. And what I was going to say when you were talking, which I think gets down to the heart of the matter, is being very realistic. I mean, in my 20s, I would have said this much differently, but in my 50s, I can say, look, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to go to a MAGA rally and say, if you just read these poems, you'll understand. But the reason these poems are so important is the people that will read these are going to have hopefully a better way or more avenues of interrogating and then being able to communicate. So that's what art's doing, right? It's the middleman, the middlewoman of this exchange. It's helping people wrap their heads around, how can I talk to someone and put myself in their shoes so that it doesn't immediately become a, if you're not on our side, you're on the other side. It's got
Yeah.
to be this invitation to connect.
And I think, as I said earlier, it's also empathy for the self, right? That opens up, yeah, I may be this uh, poor white guy, like, but really saying, damn, I've worked hard, I've done good for my life, there's more I can do. I don't, what I mean, like, understand that your life is. instead of getting angry, understanding that, yeah, or things may not be right in your life, but knowing that you are a good person, right? Or that you've done good things, right? And you've done the best you can. And sort of instead of taking that out as anger against and blaming someone else for circumstances that are beyond perhaps even your control, right? And so like my therapist, I always like to quote my therapist who said like, it's easier to scream than it is to cry. And that's also where, emotions get transferred. And so it's harder to face yourself. And it's harder to feel, I'll use it, bring it back to even my own exile community, which I think they're misunderstood in the way that they channel a lot of stuff into politics, because in some ways and not all of us, right? Right. Certainly as you get generations have passed now. But the idea that I've always seen is that, or in my sense of it, is that they had a really great loss. I mean, whatever the case was, whatever, let's not blame history, whatever, there was a great loss in their life.
Right.
And rather than having to face that loss, maybe even having to accept it because all's fair in love and war kind of thing,
Yeah.
it just gets channeled into vitriol, into politics, because again, it's easier to scream than to actually accept that loss and move on as best one can. My mom was able to do that. You know, fine, whatever happened in history. We're caught in the crosshairs and crossfire of history, but I'm not going to live the rest of my life ignoring my pain or also thinking I'm going to get that back, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, like this is what it is. I'm going to heal is a better word for it, maybe, but
Yeah.
starts with having empathy for the self and trying to understand the self a little bit better, and therefore you can understand the world around you a little bit better, I think.
Yep, yep. And I think what poetry, right, or art refuses to let us hide behind is it is easier to scream than to cry. But why is that? And then you unpack that and realize not only does it not have to be that way, it doesn't help when it's that way, but there are forces, well-moneyed, active forces exploiting and perpetuating that for their cause. And when I get frustrated, I want to scream, at Democrats. It's a terrible story. There's a lack of shame, there's a lack of irony, there's a shocking lack of self-awareness, but it's very effective because it's easier. It's fast food emotion
It's fast
as
food, yeah.
opposed to the deep work of healing oneself, then being able to, start locally with one's family and friends, and then get that tidal wave of empathy and compassion, curiosity. But we need to recognize that these cliched emotions are being exploited very actively and eagerly, and things that have humbled me that I would have thought circa 2015. There's no way we collectively can support that. Reconciling that is possible and it could get worse. That's where the urgency I think comes in, which is when we turn to art to scratch itches that op-eds and even us professors can't quite do in a classroom, but can happen in the pages.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to something to that and something you said earlier about where all this is ripple effects of colonialism and whatnot. So there's a poem in How to Love a Country called Declaration of Interdependence. And I've often thought how all of us in some ways, right, are stuck in this level of independence, right?
Yeah,
I got mine, you get yours. Don't tell me what to do. Like, and it's all the colonial, post-colonial stuff we're still dealing with. And America hasn't really had their post-colonial coming to Jesus moment
that's right.
or coming to whatever moment. Um, and so, that the idea is that really not just this country, but that all of us as the human race, we have to move from a space of independence to interdependence, which is ultimately realizing, I know it sounds very,
Yeah.
very, but you understanding that this all works together. We're all connected. In the pandemic, I thought we'd learn that lesson because you suddenly understood that the most important person in the world that you would not even bother to ask their name was the cashier who is, risking their lives every day so that you can buy some groceries to, or even the Amazon delivery person became like, I love you, right? And then there we went back to the same thing. Like these
Right.
people matter and don't matter, right? But anyway, what that poem was trying to do was also to break down the stereotypes that we have of each other, and uh, and also realize how we can discount whole regions or whole states based on
Yeah.
the color on an electoral map. I mean, we do that. I've done that.
Sure.
And not realize that there are plenty of uh, in terms of there are plenty of people that disagree with us in New York as much as in North Carolina, right? Right. It's this idea you see someone in a pickup truck, you immediately assume that X, Y, or Z, right? Or you see someone now, look what happened with Tulsa, right? That was a great example. Now suddenly it was a weird shift, right? People
Yeah.
that originally thought of this as like save the planet kind of idea, right? Now I've shifted it like, but anyway, it just started to, I just wanted to poke a little bit at that to realize we're all guilty in some ways of those
That's
things,
right.
right? And if we don't realize our own culpability in these assumptions that we're making all the time,
Yeah.
assumptions that sometimes are, they are based on some truth, but it's also not an assumption you can make, across the board, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, that poem and that poem, I don't know if I put that in the notes, but the way that poem ends, it says, I see you. The original inspiration for that poem was also how the greeting of the Zulu people, which I heard in a speech that Clinton did like years, obviously years and years ago. But
Right.
the greeting is not this sort of as we do most of us, seeing myself, hi, good morning, yeah, good morning. Like, like, how you doing? Great. My
Right.
dog died yesterday, but I'm doing great. All right. But that the greeting or the tradition of the greeting is that you look at someone straight in the eyes and you say, I see you.
Mm.
And the response is, I am here to be seen, and I see you. And I just think, we've stopped seeing each other in this country, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in many other places. I always want, this is what we know, but
Right.
it's not just here, which is also something I always try to keep in mind. Uh, what country doesn't have blood on their hands? Very few. They are, but I try to always keep that perspective too. This is what it is, but it's also part of what the evolution of a nation is about in some ways.
Absolutely. And in fact, again, to give bringing us back to the beginning, like we've invoked Percy Bysshe Shelley, James Baldwin, Walt Whitman, this connecting theme, and then getting into other cultures, certainly it's always been with us, this inhumanity, this very human kind of fallibility in terms of being able to be vulnerable and connect and have empathy. It isn't an American problem. I'm glad you mentioned that because it in some ways is more depressing because it's a deeper issue that's always been with us, but it's also why poetry and art endures through cultures and centuries because it is doing something that we need or that we turn to. And for me, I can say with, genuine conviction, like on a day-to-day basis, I'm definitely struggling with anger and sorrow and fury, inability to comprehend. But at the end of the day, what I keep coming back to is this is why art matters. This is why poetry matters, because despite everything, and when we look at history and the carnage there have been enough people that have tried to create something beautiful and have tried to make something autobiographical, invite other people into that conversation. And in fact, why, despite everything, and you alluded to it earlier, I think in the last couple of decades, I think there's some very good reasons why poetry is having a moment and can perhaps become even bigger is while we have these dumb devices, right, that are hurting our attention spans and are making us impatient and content is flooding all the time, a poem has an opportunity with its short, its brief space that it occupies and the limited amount of time it requires to get in there and work its magic in ways that perhaps novels and movies and even music can't the way they once did. I try to find real opportunity there and real signs for optimism.
Yeah, yeah, the short. Yeah, I've had this similar thought. Yeah, the nature of poetry itself, which really comes from music, right? From song and oral tradition. And when you think about how powerful a song can be, right? Because it's, what, 2 minutes, right? And it
Yep.
feels like an entire universe just emptied into you, right? And
Sure.
I think a poem has, because of the very nature of the art form of the genre, to do that, and also to create memory, like so. Um, Not only impactful in the moment, but really like stick, like in the way that a song sticks in you, right? Um, I think that we've seen more poetry, and I mean, we're in the same field, but for those of you that are not, I've seen it in so many different ways. How the generations are picking up poetry, they're listening more to poetry. Their videos, of course, helped to spoken word, which when I was going to graduate school was or performance poetry was frowned upon. It was more the academic. Those worlds are merging together beautifully.
Yeah.
They're understanding the role of poetry, again, as the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
Right.
I want to share one little anecdote that may help to think about this a little bit because it's one of those things that stayed in my mind. Um, and it's something we haven't talked about. And I think it's related to empathy in some ways. So I never really got to meet President Obama in the inauguration. I mean, you'd shake the hand and you read the
Sure.
poem and you shake it. And, the inaugural ball, I thought we were going to sit down and have martinis together and have a couple of
Right.
cigarettes. But
Right.
I've never been to an inaugural ball. It's just a big cocktail party where they just do a cameo for obvious reasons. There's
Right.
security. But he invited us, myself and my husband, to the Oval Office a couple months later. I guess as a debrief, a kind of thank you. I'm not sure exactly, but um, the one question that I had in my mind was not like, how did you pick me, or I didn't ask him that, or
Right.
why did you pick me? I asked him, how did you trust me? What do you mean? What do you mean? Like, and I said, well, I could have gotten up there and read a poem by Ginsberg. I could have, I could have given America the finger. I could have,
Yeah.
I could have fainted and passed out. I could have like vomited out of my
Right.
nerves.
Of
And
course.
he said something I'll never forget, and it took me a while to even figure out or really understand what he was saying. He said, and he went into royal language, which is interesting. He went, "See, we find that in these kinds of situations, people rise to the occasion." Or he said, we trust that people will rise again. And I thought, what does he mean by that? And ultimately, I think a healthy, that's not even use democracy, but a healthy society is based on trust. You can't, you can't legislate trust, right? And you have to trust that people will do what's 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 ultimately in the best interest of the society because understanding that that's how we're all going to survive. But you can't police, and this is where we're finding ourselves in now. And that's antithetical to this idea of a free society. I mean, I'm not even going to use democracy. I'm not going to even use even in your community, right? Even in your small town, the idea
Yeah.
of trust that we're all in this, that we trust we're going to do the right thing. And yes, we're going to do what's the better thing in that what's the we know is the better thing, right? And so
Yeah.
that has stayed with me. And you can't have a democracy without trust. And I never really thought about that.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. And what I think just in this hour we've kind of come back to over and over again is certainly something I think about a lot is it is this what society lacks, whether we're talking about poetry or just our engagement as a culture, is this combination of empathy and authenticity, authentic emotions, authentic desire to understand what's happening, and authentic desire to communicate, even if we agree to disagree, but there's an authentic and not a manufactured ideology or a manufactured talking point that is either used to divide or to misinform. But with this authenticity, it involves honesty. It involves kind of this emotional integrity. And frankly, I'll say it, Obama demonstrates it, you demonstrate it, and the people we look to in good times and bad are the ones that have clearly done the work, for themselves and their careers that are then able to want to share as opposed to, take. And I think that's where progress can happen, and that's where our hope has to lie.
Exactly. And the fact that I always also try to think that history is runs in big long arcs, right? And history will remember what, it'll come out in the wash at some point.
That's
Um,
right.
and that also gives me perhaps also a little patience, which is something that's important too. Patience and perseverance, right?
Right on. Well,
Yeah.
one of the things I talk about a lot, as it relates to my nonprofit is this notion of community and what it means and how to be a literary citizen. I would be remiss, Richard, if I didn't, look you right in the eye and say part of this is leading by example. So, of course, on a very personal level, I'm tremendously honored to have a chance to chat with you, but I think it speaks to you're making the time, you're being available, your desire to enlarge your world and therefore the world is not lost on me and the people watching. And I just encourage anyone that's watching to see someone that could find a million good excuses not to take the time to do this, doing it. It certainly fills me with inspiration and makes me want to work harder. So I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for that inspiration and that kindness.
Well, thank you. And thank you for giving me the space to do that. Again, it's interdependence here.
That's
But
right.
but thank you because we also have to learn, yes, to appreciate each other, and that's part of the journey as well.
So I could and should end with that, but I want to give you the final word for our fellow poetry lovers, our fellow citizens that are looking for a little spark of inspiration. I mean, mine's easy. I'll say pick up a book. In fact, I got a great book to recommend. But what would your parting shot be for someone that's like, yeah, yeah, you guys are, talking shop, but I'm really feeling alone. Just a word of encouragement or inspiration for anyone that might need it right now.
You know, um, for me, and this is something I'm still working on, but it's helping me a little bit. Um, and it kind of has to do with all that we're talking about, questioning our assumptions, who we think people are. Um, I'm trying to withhold judgment of things in small ways. I live in during the summer in Maine. Well, I've lived here full time for 15 years. And of course, there's many rural pockets and whatnot. And I just, whenever I go somewhere that's even more spirited than my little small town, right? Uh, I'll immediately, like, without even knowing, like, put up this guard and also say, you, oh, look at you people, like, and I have to remind myself that's not Richard the artist, right? And so I'm trying to walk that talk, so to speak. I'm trying to, like, you know what? It might be as simple as saying an authentic good afternoon or good morning to someone that you might not usually say that. That little act of opening a door. And yes, maybe you'll find that, but even in that, at least you're going to get to know a human being and get to know why perhaps they are or doing what you're doing. And maybe they'll get to know you just a little. Like sometimes we have to think really small as well. Like right there, as they say, think globally, act locally. And so I'm trying to do that to not put that guard up, which is ultimately fear and apprehension and like
Sure.
all those things that you mentioned, frustration, and not or and trying to walk the talk. Try to meet someone or just interact with someone that you ordinarily wouldn't. And that's if we start sort of just under seeing each other a little bit better, maybe I don't know, I'm not going to say that, but at least I know that it puts me in a better space. And if it puts me in the better space, and hopefully this other person who might be making these assumptions about me
Yeah.
because of the way I look or the clothes I have or whatnot, and you don't realize that too. So I say, yeah, little random acts of communication. I won't say kindness, although it is kindness, but of
Sure.
communication. Open up, just crack the door a little bit and see what happens.
Yeah, could create a spark and let nature then take it and make a conflagration. I totally put you on the spot by asking for that, but wow, what a wonderful response that again reassures me and inspires me. I think anyone checking this out. So, Richard, thank you for being here. Sharing time. Again, I will be very aggressive on my socials, reminding everyone to pick up books for inspiration, but I certainly wish you all the best, and I hope among many other things, in addition to safety and health. Um, we're looking forward to the next work. So keep doing what you're doing, and we're behind you, kind of supporting and appreciating the work you do.
Same here. Same to you.
All right, partner. Well, thank you so much, folks. Thanks for checking out Some Things Considered. Remember, we are obsessed with story and creativity. Buy a book. You can start a spark, promote the work of an author, support your literary community, support the arts, endorse the humanities. We can make a difference. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.